Hello and welcome back to the channel. This time we've got something a bit different as I'm actually going to take a look at a review. It's one of the earliest big YouTube hits, but one which looking back at it is, well, it's terrible. It's Red Letter Media's review of The Phantom Menace. These days there are many styles of film criticism and video essays based on all kinds of subjects across the film industry on YouTube. A large subsection of this is the concept of the overly critical review that is combined with some kind of comedic presentation. Think of things like Nostalgia Critic or CinemaSins. And one of the early examples of this was Red Letter Media with their series of Mr. Plinkett reviews. Mr. Plinkett being a comedy persona created by one of the reviewers. And after a few videos, the channel released a Phantom Menace review as part of that series in 2009. And that review exploded in popularity and arguably shaped much of the YouTube-based film criticism that would follow and that you see today. The problem being, really for me, when you look back at it, is it isn't really a good review, nor is it funny as comedy. Now, let's be clear. The Phantom Menace is not a great film. It does indeed have problems, but nor in my view is it as terrible as many claim that it is. I don't intend to spend this defending the Phantom Menace here, but rather explore why I think that Red Letter Media's review fails, and why it still kind of baffles me why it became so popular back in the day. The review itself takes the form of 7 videos, all around about 8 to 10 minutes long, so the whole thing comes to roughly about an hour, roughly half the actual film's runtime. The review is split into chapters with section titles that become increasingly humorous. Well, they're supposed to be humorous at least, because the humour, or rather the attempts at it, is one of the main issues with the review overall. These videos lean heavily on that style of humour that mistakes being shocking and inappropriate for being funny. Our reviewer, Mr. Plinkett, is portrayed as a character who is deeply disturbed, and the commentary is thus filled with references to suicide, murder, kidnapping, implied sexual abuse, implied child abuse, and more often than not, just the fact that something unsavoury has been said is the punchline. There's often no actual attempt at structuring anything like a joke, because it's assumed that just referencing some kind of abuse during a film review is enough to be funny. It's something you see less these days, but there was a period where the influence of comedies like South Park and Family Guy, alongside comedians like Chris Rock and Bill Hicks, saw a lot of people miss the craft in the material, and they would only take away the idea of being controversial. So a lot of early internet video comedy in particular, as creating and uploading videos became easier and easier and more accessible for people, features a lot of shock content. It's this idea that if you say something unpleasant with no to little context, then that was funny. Aside from the tedious repeated attempt to be edgy, the comedy in the review relies upon 2 other running themes or running gags, if you want to call them that. The first one is the deliberate mispronunciation of words. It's not particularly amusing the first time, and that doesn't really change by the umpteenth time it's repeated. The other recurring joke, although less common, is a gag around the idea that Mr. Plinkett describes an historical event and then names it wrong whilst calling the watching audience idiots for not knowing about it. It's every bit as unfunny as it sounds. Of course, none of the material is helped by the decision to deliver it in a droning, monotone voice that has no doubt been chosen for the character. A choice that I assume is meant to lean into the characterization of someone who is being overly analytical about mass market films. But it drains the whole exercise of any feeling of energy or momentum. But if we put aside the humour, what about the rest of the content of the review? What's it like? What kind of points does it raise? To get a sense of it, let's take a look at the opening video. It spends the bulk of its time talking about characters, and it's not really great. The review complains, for example, that The Phantom Menace suffers by not having a protagonist, but it uses a definition of protagonist that suits its argument rather than one that's accurate. Now, were the review to argue that The Phantom Menace doesn't have a protagonist or supporting character that it is easy for the audience to relate to, then that would be fair criticism. In the original Star Wars, Luke is an outsider to the situation he finds himself swept up in. Thus, he needs to have a lot of things explained to him, which has the benefit of explaining it to the audience at the same time. In the first of the prequels, there is indeed no character that is new to the situation, no outsider, no one that needs a lot of concept explained to them. So there isn't an audience surrogate in the same way. But to argue that there is no protagonist at all is just wrong. A protagonist is not the same as an audience surrogate. In Phantom Menace, Liam Neeson's Qui-Gon is clearly the main protagonist. He's probably in at least 80% of the scenes, if not more. He is the character that we are following through the story. Then, as the film splits into 4 threads towards its conclusion, each thread has its own protagonist. The Red Letter Review seems to dismiss the idea of characters being the protagonist based purely on the fact that they don't like the character. Another part of this opening section of the review briefly talks about adventure movies and how many have a structure that is essentially the hero's story template, whilst complaining that the Phantom Menace isn't structured that way, but saying that all movies don't have to be structured that way. So it basically argues that it's okay for films to vary in structure unless they are a Star Wars prequel. The first section of the review is then rounded off with a Vox Pop segment that asks people to describe characters in Star Wars from the original films as well as the prequels without talking about what they look like or what sort of job they have. This is intended to show that the characters in Phantom Menace aren't well written and they're not particularly memorable. It's a potentially interesting point with a potentially interesting way of approaching it, but I think it's let down by a few things. For example, to start with, one of the Vox Pops does start to describe a character in the Phantom Menace quite well, but this is cut away from fairly quickly to another person struggling to do so. And that just sort of underlines the issue of Vox Pops. The fact that they are under control of the broadcaster. They are easily shaped and edited to show what you want them to show. I mean, after all, answers that you don't want are easily left on the cutting room floor. On the other side, I'm not sure how demonstrative it is to ask people to talk about characters that have been ingrained into popular culture for 30 plus years and compare how easily they can describe those characters with much less well known characters. And you do wonder what a difference asking those who would have been children in 1999 would have made. After all, the review does constantly remind us that Star Wars is aimed at children. So the actual critical content of the review is hit and miss at best. From here on, the majority of the rest of the review is focused on a chronological breakdown of the film. The breakdown is made up of the sort of nitpicky pulling apart that very few films would stand up to. There are some fair points made, but a lot of it relies on the reviewer either deliberately misunderstanding or using that sort of technique of saying, but why doesn't X do Y instead? The original films are filled with these moments too, if you want. For example, why doesn't the Star Destroyer gunner near the beginning shoot the escape pod that the droids take? Isn't it lucky that the droids landed on the same side of the planet as Luke and Obi-Wan? Why doesn't the Death Star come out of hyperspace above the planet with the rebel base on instead of taking the time to orbit around the sun? How come Leia spends time comforting Luke over the death of a man he's known for a few days when everyone that she's known all of her life at home have recently been killed? A lot of the blow-by-blow criticism falls into that line of thinking that is basically the reviewer saying, I think this should work like this, but it doesn't, so I'm going to say it's stupid. It's sort of a way of applying your own imagined rules to someone else's fictional world and then complaining about it when they use their own instead. For me, the review is somewhat summed up by a comment towards the end, when the reviewer complains that in the final act of the film, we are following a fight between three guys we don't know and don't care about. Now, two of those guys are the main protagonist and a highly prominent secondary character. If you don't know who they are by now, then you've not actually been paying attention. Now, as I say, The Phantom Menace does indeed have problems in its structure and characterization, so I have nothing against someone being critical of it. What irks is that the criticism comes across as being disingenuous, a feeling that's not helped in Red Letter Media's review when it includes a number of cheap shots at George Lucas, at fanboys, and more. For example, this review complains about the battle droids being ineffective, but has anyone ever seen a stormtrooper hit anything in the original films? And whilst off-colour humour seems to have dropped away and gone out of style, I find that disingenuous critical analysis of films is something that seems to have grown, particularly when you see reviewers using the technique of taking film clips out of context and criticising them. Often these clips have been trimmed down to omit parts to make them look worse. It is something that Mystery Science Theatre 3000 is guilty of often. They edited down films to fit into the runtime of their show and often choose to make the films look sillier than they really are. But to be fair, Mystery Science Theatre 3000 never pretends that it's doing anything other than deliberately poking fun. It doesn't claim to be actual critical analysis like Red Letter Media does here. And I have to say, I don't have an issue with those reviewers on YouTube that say take a look at cult films or B movies that do so in a good spirit. You can analyse a film and be humorous without being mean-spirited about it. Indeed, I recommend the work of Brandon Tenold. He does jibe the films he looks at, but his genuine affection for the outlying corners of cinema comes through. The Red Letter Media review of Phantom Menace was hugely popular upon its release and has no doubt been influential on many that followed. But looking back at it, to me, it just comes across as a fairly spiteful piece of work that is mired in a deeply unfunny tone and approach. And it's of no surprise that when a fan of the film published a rebuttal to the review around the time of the original review's release on YouTube, Red Letter Media chose to mock in response. Anyway, that's my thoughts on really that whole kind of style of film review. One day I may get round to reviewing The Phantom Menace myself, and I think it's safe to say that I'll be approaching it in a different way. Let me know your thoughts below. Like and subscribe on all of that if you want to, and I'll catch you again soon.